The two shipping lanes are fixed, published in international maritime charts, and cannot be changed. Large crude tankers cannot reroute. Too large, too deep, too slow. Bypass pipelines together can redirect about 6.5 million barrels daily around the strait. The strait carries 20 million. That leaves a gap of 13 to 14 million barrels per day with no alternative, equivalent to removing Saudi Arabia and Iraq from global supply simultaneously. The nuclear program gets the headlines, but the strait is the real weapon, the one requiring no enriched uranium, the one 2,500 years of Persian strategic thinking has been building toward. And the country that understood this most clearly, most quietly, is not the United States, it is China. And that realization changes everything about the next 20 years. China receives 37.7% of all crude oil moving through the Strait of Hormuz, more than any other country by a wide margin. India, 14.7%. South Korea, 12%. Japan, nearly 11%. Together, China and India absorb 44% of every barrel exiting the Persian Gulf. Japan gets roughly 70% of all its crude through this single passage. And here's the number that ties all of it together. The economic output of those four nations, China, India, Japan, South Korea, represents nearly half the GDP of the entire planet. And here's the geopolitical irony almost no one discusses openly. The United States now imports only about 2% of its oil through Hormuz. American shale production has made Washington functionally energy independent from the Persian Gulf. The country spending an estimated $80 billion per year to keep the strait open, with Fifth Fleet headquarters in Bahrain, 200 miles from the Iranian coast, is guarding a door that primarily benefits its largest strategic competitor. China has historically allowed the United States to police the strait on its behalf, a delegation that costs Beijing nothing and costs Washington enormously. Iran has understood this tension for years and exploited it deliberately. Every time Tehran threatens to close the strait, it is not primarily threatening the U.S., it is threatening China, India, Japan, South Korea. It is telling those countries, your energy security is hostage to your relationship with us, not with Washington. In 2023, China brokered a diplomatic normalization between Iran and Saudi Arabia, conducted entirely without American involvement, the first major act of Chinese Gulf diplomacy in history. Beijing was signaling it was ready to manage the Gulf on its own terms. China now holds an estimated 1.4 billion barrels of strategic oil in reserve, the largest stockpile in the world, larger than the combined reserves of the US, Japan, OECD Europe, South Korea, and India. Beijing built that reserve because its analysts understood that a Hormuz disruption was not a hypothetical. It was a scheduled event. They just didn't know the date. Here's the objection many American viewers are probably feeling right now. Iran is an authoritarian theocracy that funds terrorism and has threatened to destroy its neighbors. Why should any of this history excuse that? It is a fair question. None of this history excuses it. Understanding why a country behaves the way it does is not the same as approving of what it does. You can hold both truths at once, that Iran's government has committed real atrocities, and that Western governments created the conditions that made it nearly inevitable. The comments section is going to disagree loudly on this. Good. That is exactly what this channel is for. For 2,500 years, every dominant power, Persia, Greece, Portugal, Britain, the United States, arrived at the same conclusion: control the strait, control the world's commerce. Each one paid an enormous price to hold it. Each one eventually lost it or was forced to share it under terms they did not choose. The only constant has been Iran, not because of military strength, not because of oil wealth, because it lives there. That is the lesson history keeps delivering, and the lesson every foreign power keeps failing to absorb before it is too late. If you've stayed this far, subscribe and ring the bell. Every time a crisis hits your news feed, we'll have already told you where it came from. Now, back to the thread, and to the question hiding inside everything we've covered. Every foreign power that lost control of the strait was surprised when it happened. The Portuguese had a fortress. The British had a century of regional dominance. The Americans had the most powerful navy in history and 40 years of continuous presence. All of them believed their hold was permanent. What they all missed was a decision made by one man in Tehran, a decision most Americans have never heard explained clearly. It begins in 1953. The CIA coup that removed Mohammad Mossadegh is the foundational grievance of every Iranian government since 1979. Mossadegh was not a communist, not an Islamist, a constitutional Democrat with a Swiss law degree, Time magazine's Man of the Year in 1951. He nationalized the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company because his parliament voted to, because the British firm was taking 84% of Iranian oil profits and returning 16%. The British responded with a global embargo. The American response 2 years later was Operation Ajax, the CIA's first known successful coup run by Kermit Roosevelt Jr., grandson of Theodore Roosevelt, on a budget of $1 million. It took 19 days. Mossadegh was arrested in his pajamas. The Shah was returned. A new arrangement gave American and British companies 80% of Iranian oil profits. For 26 years, the Shah held power through Savak, a secret police force trained by the CIA and Mossad. Thousands of political prisoners, systematic torture. When the revolution came in 1979, it wasn't because Iranians suddenly became religious. It came because a nation had watched foreign intelligence remove their elected government and keep a monarch in power while their oil wealth flowed abroad. That history is why Iran's relationship with the Strait is not strategic. It is existential. The Strait is the one card no foreign power can remove without physically occupying the entire Iranian coastline, the geographic insurance policy against another 1953. Every time sanctions tighten, every time a carrier group moves into the Gulf, the Iranian government looks at its shore batteries and swarm boats and knows, we cannot be removed again the way Mossadegh was removed, because the cost of trying would be paid at gas pumps in every country on Earth. Iran's control of Hormuz is not the problem that needs solving. It is the solution to a problem foreign powers created. And what most coverage misses, Hormuz is not only an oil choke point. Roughly 30% of all internationally traded fertilizers transit the strait. Qatar's LNG heats homes across Europe, all through Hormuz. Global helium supply, without which semiconductor manufacturing stops, flows overwhelmingly from Qatar. What moves through those 21 miles is the physical infrastructure of modern civilization. Here is the thread pulled taut. In 550 BCE, Cyrus recognized a 21-mile gap in the geography of the known world and built an empire around controlling it. In 1507, Albuquerque arrived with warships and installed a customs house on an island in the middle of it. In 1622, a Persian Shah burned that customs house down. In 1908, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company drilled the first well beside it. In 1953, American and British intelligence removed the man who tried to reclaim its profits. In 1979, the revolution he made possible gave control to a government that turned it into the most valuable strategic asset on Earth. In 1988, that government proved it could make 21 miles of water economically uninhabitable for any foreign navy. In 2023, the country that most needs what moves through it brokered a Gulf normalization without a single American diplomat in the room. That is the story. Not Iran versus America. Geography versus ambition. The one fact that 2,500 years of history has tested and never once overturned. If you live beside the door, you control the door. Everyone else is a visitor with a warship. The consequences are in your phone right now. The gas price from this week. The shipping estimate on your last order. The grocery bill that hasn't stopped climbing. All of it runs through calculations by insurance actuaries and military planners in Washington, Beijing, Tehran, and Riyadh, all staring at the same map. A 21-mile gap. 20 million barrels a day past a coastline that has been Iranian for longer than Rome was Roman. The Achaemenid Persians called it a threshold named after God. The Portuguese called it a cash register. The British called it a vital interest. The Americans called it a choke point. The Iranians have always called it home. That difference between a strategic asset and a home is the entire explanation. For the tanker war, the nuclear standoffs, the 1953 coup not acknowledged until 2013, the revolution that shocked a CIA that had spent 26 years believing it had the country controlled. No foreign power has permanently held this passage in 2,500 years. Every empire that arrived believing it owned the door eventually left. The people who live beside it are still there. Share this with someone who watches the news and wonders why none of it connects. Tell us in the comments, which empire do you want to see fall next? The other choke point, the one controlling the Pacific half of this equation, that China has spent 20 years quietly surrounding, that is the next episode. There is a line in the CIA's declassified files on Operation Ajax, released in 2013. An internal assessment after Mossadegh's arrest warned that using foreign power to reverse a popular mandate would generate consequences impossible to predict or contain. It took 26 years. Those consequences are still arriving. That is how empires work, not with a single collapse, but with an invisible unraveling of legitimacy until the moment it becomes undeniable. The Strait of Hormuz is a measuring instrument for that unraveling. A 21-mile gauge of how much of the American century remains and how much of the Persian millennium is still to come. Fallen empires, ancient empires, modern consequences. Stories that explain the world you live in today. The water is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. 2 shipping lanes, each barely 2 miles across. Right now, 138 ships pass through here every single day. Tankers so large they can be seen from space, carrying 20 million barrels of oil toward China, India, Japan, and South Korea. 20 million barrels. every single day. Here is what most people don't realize. Iran doesn't need a single nuclear weapon to hold the global economy hostage. It just needs to close 21 miles of water. The Strait of Hormuz carries 25% of all the world's seaborne oil. Not Middle Eastern oil. All the oil that moves by ship on this entire planet. It sits inside waters Iran has claimed as its own since 1979. The price of gas at your station, the cost of shipping the phone in your pocket, all of it flows through a corridor one country threatens to shut down every time Washington gets too close. Most Americans think the real threat from Iran is nuclear. They are looking at the wrong weapon. The strait is the one that has actually worked. The one that doesn't require enriched uranium, that was already dangerous when Rome was paying Persian tolls to reach India, and that is more consequential today than at any point in recorded history. To understand why Iran holds this power, you need to understand something most maps refuse to show clearly. The Persian Gulf is not a body of water, it is a geographic cage. A long, narrow basin, 600 miles long, nearly 200 miles wide at its broadest, surrounded almost entirely by land on every side. 6 countries pour their oil into it: Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, Qatar, the UAE, and Iran. But there is only one exit, one door out to the open ocean, and it is 21 miles wide. Around 550 BCE, Cyrus the Great built the first empire to deliberately connect the Persian Gulf to the overland Silk Road, understanding that whoever controlled the exit controlled the trade of the known world. Silk from China, spices from India, pearls harvested from these same waters for over 7,000 years before a single oil well was ever drilled. The value moving through this passage in the ancient world was equivalent, in proportion, to the oil moving through it today. This was not a geographic accident. It was the first recognition in recorded history that a cage with one door is the most valuable piece of real estate on Earth. The name Hormuz connects to Hormizd, the Middle Persian form of Ahura Mazda, supreme deity of Zoroastrianism, lord of wisdom and cosmic order. The ancient Persians didn't merely build a trade route here, they consecrated it. Not a gap in a map, a threshold between worlds. A place named after God. You don't simply transit a place named after God, you negotiate with it. Alexander the Great arrived in 325 BCE and grasped the geometry immediately. He sent his admiral Nearchus on the first recorded survey voyage through these waters, from the Indus River back to Susa, the Persian capital, proving a navigable corridor linked India to the Iranian heartland. The night before Nearchus departed, according to Arrian, Alexander could not sleep. He walked the camp alone, knowing the fleet might be destroyed, knowing he might never see the Mediterranean again. He sent him anyway. Alexander died before he could fortify the passage. His generals divided his empire, and the strait fell back into Persian hands. For the next 8 centuries, the Sassanid Persian Empire taxed everything moving through these waters. Roman merchants paid Persian tolls to reach India. Byzantine traders negotiated with Persian governors for access to the spice routes. The strait was, in every practical sense, a Persian toll booth on the blood supply of the ancient world. Empires rose and fell around it. The religion changed. The language evolved across centuries of invasion, but the geography did not move a single mile. By 651 CE, the Sassanids had collapsed under Arab armies carrying Islam. Persia absorbed the religion and remade it, transforming Sunni doctrine into the distinct Shia Islam that defines Iran today. The strait's keeper changed. The logic of controlling it did not. the next empire to claim it came not from the desert, but from the sea. When the Portuguese arrived in 1507, they didn't come to trade. They came to own. If you've never heard this told this way, subscribe. Every week we trace the roots of the world you live in. In 1507, Afonso de Albuquerque sailed into the Strait of Hormuz with a fleet of warships and presented the local sultan with a choice: submission or destruction. The sultan submitted. Within 8 years, Portugal had built a fortress on the island of Hormuz, and every ship wanting to pass from the Persian Gulf to the Indian Ocean had to pay a Portuguese toll. They called the permits cartazas, paid permission to trade in your own ancestral waters. For 107 years, the world's most important passage operated as a Portuguese cash register. Most Western history books treat this as a footnote in the age of exploration, an adventure story about brave sailors and distant spices. I think that misses the point entirely. What Portugal did in 1507 was not exploration. It was the first modern seizure of an energy choke point by a foreign power. And the memory of it, 107 years of European ships collecting tolls from Persian, Arab, and Indian merchants who had been trading through these waters for 1,000 years before the first Portuguese map was drawn. That memory never left. It left in 1622. Shah Abbas I of Safavid Persia, tired of watching foreign Christians profit from Persian geography, made a strategic alliance with the British East India Company. Together they drove the Portuguese out, dismantled the fortress, and burned the customs house to the waterline. The alliance worked. But notice what replaced Portuguese control: British influence. The strait changed European owners, not direction. For the next 3 centuries, Britain became the dominant naval power in the Persian Gulf. The East India Company, and later the British Crown, established treaties with every ruler on the Arabian coast, the Trucial States, which you know today as the United Arab Emirates. They built naval stations. They suppressed piracy selectively. They drew borders. The borders of Iraq, Kuwait, the UAE, all drawn or heavily influenced by British cartographers who understood, a century before OPEC existed, that the Persian Gulf was the engine room of the modern world. Iran was surrounded by a British-designed neighborhood, and the Persians knew exactly what that meant. In 1908, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company drilled the first major oil well in southwest Iran. The Persian Gulf, the ancient toll booth, the sacred threshold named after God, had just become the foundation of the 20th century global economy. By the 1950s, the company, renamed British Petroleum, was keeping roughly 84% of Iranian oil profits and returning 16% to the country that owned the oil. In 1951, Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh nationalized the oil industry. His parliament voted for it. The British responded with a global embargo. The Americans responded 2 years later with a CIA-orchestrated coup, removing Mossadegh and reinstalling the Shah as an American-backed authoritarian. The Iranian people did not forget. 26 years later, that memory produced a revolution that changed the geography of global power. And the man who led it understood something no Western government wanted to acknowledge out loud. You don't need an army to close 21 miles of water. You just need the will to try. The test of that theory, the proof of concept that still shapes every military calculation in the Gulf today, begins in September 1980. February 1979. Ayatollah Khomeini stepped off a plane at Mehrabad Airport after 14 years in exile. The crowd was estimated at 5 million people, the largest political gathering in recorded human history to that point. The Shah had fled weeks earlier, and the new Islamic Republic immediately began redesigning its relationship with the Strait. Here is the number that explains everything that follows. By the end of the 1970s, the Persian Gulf held approximately 80% of the world's proven oil reserves. 80%. Iran sat at the gate of all of it. Khomeini's government had no interest in cooperating with the Western economies that had, in the Iranian reading of history, been looting that gate for 70 years. The test came fast. In September 1980, Iraq, led by Saddam Hussein and quietly encouraged by Washington, which feared Khomeini's revolution spreading across the region, invaded Iran. The war lasted 8 years and killed between 500,000 and 1 million people, the bloodiest conventional war since Korea. At its peak, it produced something the world had never seen before: 2 oil-producing nations deliberately targeting each other's tankers in the Persian Gulf, daring the other to bleed out economically. Historians call it the Tanker War. Between 1984 and 1988, Iran and Iraq attacked 451 commercial ships combined. Iraq, 283 strikes, Iran, 168. Insurance rates for the Persian Gulf tripled, then quadrupled. Shipping companies refused to enter the Gulf without military escorts. The United States entered the strait in 1987 under Operation Earnest Will, the largest convoy operation since World War II, reflagging Kuwaiti tankers as American vessels to give them U.S. Navy protection. Iran responded with mines. On April 14, 1988, the USS Samuel B. Roberts struck one of those mines. The blast blew a 15-foot hole in the hull and lifted the stern 10 feet out of the water. No sailors died. 4 days later, the U.S. launched Operation Praying Mantis, the largest American naval surface engagement since World War II, sinking or severely damaging half of Iran's operational naval fleet in a single afternoon. Iran did not close the strait. But here is what matters. They tried. And in trying, with mines, patrol boats, and shore-based missiles, they demonstrated something that permanently changed how military planners everywhere think about choke point warfare. You don't need to match the U.S. Navy ship for ship to make the strait unusable. You need to make the insurance companies afraid. You need to raise the cost of transit until the economics collapse. Iran spent 8 years learning exactly how to do that, and burned the lesson into their doctrine permanently. The war ended in August 1988 with a UN ceasefire. Iran had lost half its navy in one afternoon, but it had proven, at terrible cost, that a determined regional power could bring the entire global economy to the edge of panic over 21 miles of water. What the West saw as a military defeat, Iran's Revolutionary Guard saw as a proof of concept. They spent the next 4 decades building a more sophisticated version of the same weapon. Leave a comment. Do you think the West ever truly absorbed that lesson? Because the specific weapons and doctrine Iran built afterward concern military planners more than any nuclear program. That comes next. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, controls the Strait of Hormuz. Not the Iranian Navy, not the Iranian Air Force. The IRGC, a parallel military organization created after 1979, to protect the Islamic Republic from both foreign enemies and internal dissent. Understanding the difference matters more than almost anything else in this story. The regular Iranian Navy uses conventional doctrine, ships against ships, the warfare the U.S. Navy dominates absolutely. After 1988, the IRGC Navy built something different. They studied what worked in the tanker war and ignored what failed. The result was a doctrine built around 4 pillars: swarm tactics, fast attack boats in coordinated packs of 20, 30, 40 vessels simultaneously, too numerous and too dispersed to track on radar. Anti-ship cruise missiles. The Chinese supplied C-802 and domestically produced Noor, fired from shore batteries hidden in mountains along Iran's 1,500-mile Persian Gulf coastline. Hundreds of mines, placed so that even the threat of a minefield forces shipping to slow or stop entirely. And GPS spoofing and jamming systems that make precise navigation through a 21-mile channel extraordinarily dangerous. Picture the radar screen of a tanker captain transiting the strait at 3 in the morning. On a normal night, a handful of contacts, other tankers, a Coast Guard vessel, a naval ship in the distance. Now picture the screen filling with 40 contacts, all moving fast, all converging from multiple directions at once. That is what IRGC swarm tactics look like from inside a 300,000-ton supertanker that cannot accelerate, cannot maneuver sharply, and cannot call for help fast enough for it to matter. The captain has one option: stop. Which is precisely the point. U.S. military analysts call this A2AD, anti-access area denial. The strategy of a nation that cannot defeat a superpower directly, but can make the cost of engaging it unacceptably high. Iran has spent 40 years and billions of dollars building the most sophisticated A2AD system in the world for exactly one purpose: make Hormuz militarily toxic for anyone threatening the Islamic Republic. Iran's coastline runs the entire northern length of the Persian Gulf. Every tanker transiting the strait passes within range of Iranian shore-based missiles for the entire passage.